It's 1973 and America is on its knees. The Arab oil embargo has just strangled the country's energy supply. Gas lines stretch for miles, the economy is in free fall, and inside a quiet lab in New Jersey, a scientist named Stanley Whittingham has just done something that should have changed everything. He built a rechargeable battery so powerful and so energy dense that it should have launched the electric supply revolution not in 2010, not in 2000, but rather in 1976. So, why haven't you ever heard of it? Here's something most people don't know. Exxon, yes, that Exxon, the oil giant, was for a brief bizarre moment in history on the cutting edge of battery science. The oil crisis had spooked everyone, including the oil companies, because if petroleum was finite, because if geopolitics could choke supply overnight, then whoever controlled the next energy technology would be able to control the next century. So Exxon poured money into research, a lot of money into research, and they hired one of the smartest electrochemists in the world to lead that charge. Stanley Whittingham, who would later win the 2019 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, developed a battery using two revolutionary materials: lithium metal for anode and titanium disulfide for cathode, and the results were incredible. The actual electrochemical science is a bit beyond my pay grade to explain, but what you need to know was that it was truly incredible due to a phenomena known as intercalation, which in simple terms is basically lithium ions moving in and out of layered crystal structures. But the practical result of this was a battery that could charge fast, discharge efficiently, and store enormous amounts of energy for its size. Whittingham cells were hitting 2 volts. This doesn't sound like much right now, but in the context of 1970s battery science, this was equivalent to a moon landing. Exxon filed patents, they built prototypes, and they ran tests. By the mid-1970s, they had a working rechargeable lithium battery, years, arguably decades ahead of what would eventually reach the consumer market, and then they just stopped. By 1980, oil prices had recovered, the panic had faded, and inside Exxon's boardrooms, the calculus had changed once again. Battery research was extremely expensive, the returns were quite uncertain, and fundamentally, Exxon was an oil company. Electrification wasn't a goal they were striving towards, it was the threat to their business. So why fund the technology that would eventually make your core product obsolete? The lithium-titanium disulfide program was quietly wound down, not with a bang, but rather with a budget line that just sadly fizzled out. And Whittingham, he moved on. He took a position at Binghamton University. He kept working on lithium intercalation chemistry. But the industrial infrastructure, the capital, the manufacturing pipeline that Exxon could have built, all of that evaporated in a moment. The lithium-ion battery that eventually changed the world, the one in your phone right now, the one that is powering the current global energy transition, it wasn't commercialized until 1991 by Sony in Japan, 15 years later. And the core principle, lithium ions moving in and out of layered crystal structures, is the same fundamental chemistry Whittingham demonstrated at Exxon in 1976. What Sony did wasn't a new discovery per se, but rather something that they rediscovered. Now, let's talk about what a 15-year head start actually means. The global lithium-ion battery market is currently valued at over $100 billion and is currently growing at roughly 18% per year. Electric vehicles are projected to represent 40% of all new car sales by 2030. Grid-scale battery storage, the backbone of renewable energy, is being deployed at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction merely a decade ago. All of that momentum, all of that investment, all of those emissions could have been avoided, and this could have started in the early 1980s. Climate scientists have a concept called cumulative emissions. It's not just where emissions are now. It's about every ton of CO2 that was ever added to the atmosphere. Every year of delay on electrification is baked into the climate math permanently forever. A 15-year acceleration in battery tech would have meant 15 more years of electric vehicles on the road, 15 more years of grid storage absorbing renewable energy instead of curtailing it, 15 more years of petroleum demand that simply didn't happen. The numbers are staggering, and unfortunately, they are a historical fact. There is nothing changing this. So this is just an Exxon story. right? Evil oil company suppresses battery tech. Not quite, and this is where it gets a bit more complicated. Because Exxon wasn't the only place doing this sort of research. Bell Labs, Stanford, various European institutions, all of them were poking at lithium chemistry in the 1970s. This is not a problem about how one company buried the technology. The issue honestly feels a bit more systemic. In the United States, there was no institutional mechanism to take a promising laboratory result and turn it into a national industrial priority. But in Japan, they had MITI, the Minister of International Trade and Industry, and they were doing exactly that. They were identifying strategic technologies, coordinating between entire corporations, and pushing them to commercialization with government backing. When Sony developed the lithium-ion battery in 1991, it was a product of deliberate, coordinated national strategy that had been building for a decade. This wasn't just a lucky accident. In America, they had the technology first and the institutional will last. The patents sat in filing cabinets, the research scattered, and the manufacturing expertise, the thing that takes a lab result and turns it into a mass-produced product, that went to Asia. This is to me quite indicative of a system that wasn't designed to translate discovery into deployment. Here's the really cool part. Those original 1970s patents are still readable, and researchers today have actually gone back to them. The lithium-titanium disulfide chemistry that Whittingham developed isn't a historical curiosity. It's still quite competitive. In certain applications, particularly ones that require ultra-fast charging or operation in extreme temperatures, Whittingham's cells still have a real advantage over modern lithium-ion designs. The problem in the 1970s was actually the anode. Lithium metal is energy dense, but it's also a bit dangerous. It can form dendrites, tiny metallic spikes during charging, which can pierce the battery separator and end up causing fires. Whittingham knew of this, and it's part of why the technology ended up stalling. The thing is that the solid-state batteries that every major manufacturer is racing to commercialize right now, they solve the dendrite problem. The electrolyte isn't liquid anymore, it's solid, and solid electrolytes are far more resistant to lithium dendrite penetration. In other words, the solution that would have unlocked Whittingham's 1970s chemistry, we did end up spending 50 years developing it, and now we have it. Though wheel has turned, the chemistry that was ahead of its time in 1976 may actually have a second act, finally paired with the electrolyte technology that it always needed. So what do we take from all this? Not that all companies are evil, well, arguably not for this reason specifically at least. Not that the scientists failed. In fact, Whittingham and his colleagues did do the work. The lesson here is about systems, about how societies convert discovery into deployment, and about how the gap between what's possible in a laboratory and what actually ends up reaching the world. We think of tech progress as a straight line. Someone invents something, it gets commercialized, it spreads. But the history of the lithium battery shows that that line can end up forking. It can double back. It can sit dormant in a filing cabinet for a decade and a half while the world uses inferior alternatives. The question isn't just what can science discover? It's what structures do we need to build around the science to make sure that we see the value of new inventions, to ensure that discoveries don't end up getting lost. Because right now, there are almost certainly laboratory results sitting in university archives and corporate R&D files that could be the next titanium disulfide moment. Technologies that are technically viable but institutionally stranded, waiting for the right capital, policy framework, or the manufacturing ecosystem that would push them into the world. The question is whether we've learned enough from history to find them before we need them. Stanley Whittingham ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 2019. The committee cited his foundational work on lithium intercalation, the same work he did at Exxon in the 1970s that was quietly shelved and almost forgotten. In his acceptance speech, he said that the goal was never actually the battery. The goal was always the energy. We had a tool for the energy 50 years ago. We're still building towards it now. If you found the story as mind-bending as I did, then subscribe. We cover the buried histories and overlooked turning points that shape the world we actually live in.